The candle in the window of the small back parlor at Wexley House had guttered twice already, and Prudence, who had been standing quite still for the better part of an hour, watched the wax gather at its base like the slow accumulation of every hour she had spent waiting to be told what her life was to be. Her hands, folded before her, ached from being folded. The bombazine of her second-best gown pressed against her ribs, where the seamstress had let it out and let it out again, and the seamstress, who was a kind woman, had said nothing at all, when Prudence stepped into the fitting-glass and looked away from what she saw there. Beyond the parlor door in the drawing-room, where the fire was proper and the lamps were lit, her aunt was speaking about her as though she were a horse to be sold. "She is a large girl, of course," Mrs. Farley was saying in the voice she reserved for describing weather no one could help. "But she is a very useful sort of large. Steady, sensible. And her father left her the Marchcombe portion outright, which is not a small matter, your grace, as I am sure your solicitor has explained. A duke does not marry for figure. A duke marries for continuance." The word continuance made a small, cold sound in Prudence's chest. She had learned over 26 years to catch those sounds before they showed on her face. She had learned it early, in schoolrooms, at cousins' dances, at the tea-tables of women who spoke about her as if she could not hear because she was too large to be noticed and too quiet to be feared. She could hear perfectly. She had always heard perfectly. It was one of the several useful things about her that no one had ever bothered to remark upon. She had been told, that morning, that a duke was coming to look at her, not to court her. There had been no courting. To look, His Grace the Duke of Ravenshaw needed a wife by Michaelmas, and Michaelmas was 3 weeks off. There were trustees involved, and a codicil, and a house in the north that had not seen a duchess since his mother's death 15 years ago. Prudence had listened to the summary from her aunt, as one listens to a recipe for a dish one has not been asked whether one wished to eat. And here is the thing, child, for you must understand this before the story turns, and it will turn. Prudence had not been unhappy about it, not at first. She had been, in fact, quietly and dangerously hopeful. Because the Duke of Ravenshaw was known to be a serious man, a grave man, a man who did not laugh in drawing-rooms and did not chase actresses at the theater, and Prudence had allowed herself, in the privacy of her bed the night before, to imagine that a serious man might see her seriously. A large woman composed in a body, the world remarked on, is permitted, occasionally, one such thought. The parlor door opened. Her aunt's maid, Betty, whose apron Prudence had mended twice that month, because Betty's eyes were failing, and she was ashamed to ask, put her head in and said softly, "They are ready for you, miss." Prudence walked into the drawing-room the way she had trained herself to walk into every room, head level, breath even, hands unclasped at the last moment so they would hang naturally at her sides. She had drilled this in her own bedroom against a mirror the size of a book. She looked at the Duke first, because that was the point of her being there. He was tall, dark-coated, standing at the mantel with his back not quite to the fire, and his gloves still on. He was handsome in the way that granite is handsome. His eyes, when they met hers, moved over her once, from the crown of her hair to the hem of her gown, and returned to her face with the small contained flicker of a man who has been shown the account and is confirming the figure. He did not smile. He did not need to. She had not, in her hopeful hour the night before, imagined him smiling. She had only imagined him seeing. And she thought, in the first 3 seconds of that drawing-room, that he had seen her, and that it had not made him turn away. "Miss Marchcombe," he said. His voice was low and even, and he inclined his head, precisely as much as a duke inclined his head to the niece of a country widow. "Thank you for receiving me." Your Grace, she said and curtsied and did not blush, and did not fumble, because she had rehearsed that too. They spoke for perhaps a quarter of an hour. It was not a conversation. It was the sort of examination that the polite classes conducted, when they had already decided the outcome, and required only that the paperwork be witnessed. He asked whether she had lived long in the country. She said she had. He asked whether she read. She said she did, and named 3 books, and watched his eyes catch just faintly on the third, which was not a lady's book. He asked whether she would object to living some months of each year at his northern seat. She said she would not. He asked at last whether she understood the nature of what was being proposed. I understand that your Grace requires a wife, she said, and kept her voice level. And that I have been described to you as suitable. I understand also, your Grace, that suitability and affection are not the same thing, and that I am not to be so foolish as to expect the second dressed up as the first. Something moved, then, in his face. Very small. A tightening at the corner of the mouth. She did not know, in that moment, whether it was approval or discomfort, or the passage of a thought he had not intended to have. She decided, cautiously, to record it as the first. You are sensible, Miss Marchcombe, he said. I have been called worse, she said, and permitted herself the smallest dry lift at the edge of the words. Being sensible is what I am praised for when nothing else is available. Her aunt made a strangled sound. The Duke did not smile, but he looked at her a beat longer than he had looked at her before, and Prudence felt, somewhere behind her ribs, a small, foolish, treacherous warmth. The banns were called the following Sunday. She was to be the Duchess of Ravenshaw by the last day of the month. She did not sleep that first night after the banns. She lay in her narrow bed under the sloping roof of her aunt's house and let herself, in the dark where no one could see, unclench her hands. She thought about the northern estate she had never seen. She thought about being introduced as Duchess. She thought about a man who did not smile, but who had looked at her a beat longer than he needed to. She was old enough to know better than to build a life out of a beat, and yet she built, in the dark, a small, quiet house of it. The wedding was set for Tuesday morning at St. Anselm's, in the city, quietly, without fuss, because his Grace preferred a private ceremony, and because a bride of Miss Marchcombe's proportions, as her aunt had let slip to the modiste, did not benefit from spectacle. Prudence had heard that too. She had said nothing. She had chosen a gown of pearl gray silk, because she would not wear white and be laughed at, and because gray, she had decided long ago, was the color of a woman who intended to be looked past rather than looked at. She arrived at St. Anselm's on the Tuesday morning, at the appointed hour. Her uncle handed her down from the carriage. The bells were not rung. The church was cold. There were in the pews perhaps a dozen people, none of them known to her. She walked up the aisle on her uncle's arm, and her uncle, who was not a cruel man, but was a tired one, patted her hand once and murmured, "There, my dear," as though she had been convinced of something. The altar was empty. The clergyman was there, in his surplice, and the clerk was there with the register open, and there was a pale young man in a curate's collar who kept glancing toward the vestry door, as though a man might yet step through it. But the Duke of Ravenshaw was not there, his seconds were not there, his solicitor was not there. There was, on the front pew, where his party ought to have been, a single folded letter, sealed with the Ravenshaw arms, and it lay on the wood as if it had been placed by a hand that did not wish to be seen leaving it. Her uncle stopped walking. Prudence, whose training had gone very deep, did not stop. She walked the last 3 paces to the altar rail alone. The clergyman looked at her with an expression she would remember all her life, pity dressed up as embarrassment, because he could not decide which was more polite. "Miss Marchcombe," he said quietly. Perhaps, you had better sit. She did not sit. She turned, without haste, and walked back down the aisle to the front pew and picked up the letter and broke the seal and read it standing there in her pearl gray silk with her hand steady, because her hand had been trained to be steady and would obey her now if it had never obeyed her before. The letter was 3 sentences long. His Grace regretted, upon further reflection, that he could not in conscience proceed with a union entered into on such practical terms. His Grace's affections were, and had for some time been, engaged elsewhere, and it would be a greater cruelty to Miss Marchcombe to bind her to a man whose heart could not attend her. His Grace hoped Miss Marchcombe would accept, with the letter, a settlement of £2,000, which his solicitor would arrange at her convenience. She read it twice. She folded it. She put it into her reticule. The whispering had already begun in the pews behind her. The pale curate was staring at the floor. Her aunt, arriving late as she always did, was standing at the back of the church with her mouth open in a small round O of scandal that would, Prudence knew even in that moment, be told and retold in every drawing-room from here to the coast by supper-time. His affections had for some time been engaged elsewhere. She walked out of St. Anselm's on her own 2 feet, past her aunt, past the whispering pews, past the pale curate, and into the gray September light of the street. Her uncle followed her out, saying her name. She did not stop. She got into the carriage. She sat down. She placed her hands, still gloved, in her lap. Then, and only then, in the dark of the carriage, she permitted herself one breath that came out uneven, just the one. There had not been time, She would learn, later, that the mistress the letter had spoken of was a widow named Lady Isolde Marchand, who had been the Duke of Ravenshaw's companion for 3 years, and whom his mother had refused to receive. She would learn that the Duke had gone to Lady Isolde's house from the very door of the church, and that the 2 of them had taken his traveling carriage north within the hour. She would learn that the whole of the small wedding party had been sent home with the same 3-sentence letter, in slightly different hands, because the Duke had not troubled himself even to compose a fresh apology. She would learn, in short, that she had been discarded not as a woman but as a decision. But men are slow, child, and dukes are slowest of all. And a man who mistakes what he has laid down for what he can pick up again at his leisure will find sometimes that the world has walked on without him. Remember that. It is the whole story. Prudence went, that same afternoon, not back to her aunt's house, but to the town lodgings of an elderly cousin of her father's. One Mistress Honora Vale, a childless widow of independent means who had, 10 years earlier, tried to intervene in the general treatment of Prudence in her aunt's household and been rebuffed for her pains. Prudence had never forgotten. She arrived at Mistress Vale's door with her small trunk, the £2,000 not yet touched, her pearl gray silk still on, and 1 sentence prepared. "Cousin," she said, when Mistress Vale herself opened the door and stared, "I have been jilted at the altar, and I find I cannot go home. May I stay with you?" Mistress Vale, who was a small upright woman with a face like a fond hawk, looked her up and down once and said, "Come inside this instant, Prudence, and do not, for the love of God, tell me the whole thing until you have had tea." She stayed with Mistress Vale for 6 weeks. In that time she wept exactly twice. Once, on the first night, into a pillow she had turned, so the maid would not see the stain, and once, on the 3rd week, when a letter came from her aunt, suggesting that if Prudence returned home now and comported herself with proper modesty, the whole matter might in time be forgotten. She burned that letter in the grate, and did not weep again. What she did instead was work. Mistress Vale, it happened, kept her own accounts, having lost patience with 3 successive stewards, and she kept them in a state of gentle chaos that would have shocked a Dutch merchant. Prudence, who had been taught ledgers by her father in the years before he lost his mind and then his fortune to the gaming tables, sat down with Mistress Vale's books on the second morning, and over the course of a week, unpicked them, straightened them, and presented her cousin with a summary that showed her to be £400 a year better off than she had believed. Mistress Vale looked at the summary. Then she looked at Prudence. "My dear," she said, "you have a mind. Did no one ever tell you?" "They told me I was sensible," Prudence said. "Sensible," said Mistress Vale, "is the word for a horse that does not need to be fed. You have a mind, Prudence, and you are going to use it, and I am going to help you, because I have been waiting 10 years to be useful to you, and I do not intend to waste the opportunity." It was Mistress Vale who took her, in the 4th week, to a small gathering at the house of the Dowager Countess of Ellsworth, a friend of Mistress Vale's, from their girlhood, who received on Thursdays, and did not care who came so long as they could hold a sentence. It was there, in a green drawing-room with a low fire and a strong afternoon light, that Prudence, seated slightly apart because she had chosen a chair that put her back to the light rather than the window, was addressed by a tall man in a dark coat whom she did not know. He was perhaps 35, fair-haired, gray-eyed, plainly dressed for the room, though the plainness, she noticed at once, was the sort of plainness that cost a great deal. He had come across the room with the manner of a man who noticed a person no one else had noticed and had decided, without theater, to correct the oversight. "Forgive me," he said. "You are Miss Marchcombe, I think." She looked up. She had been prepared, for weeks, to hear her name spoken with the particular curl of a stranger who had heard the story. This man did not curl it. He said her name, as though it were only her name. "I am," she said. "My name is Alistair Wycliffe," he said, and inclined his head. "The Countess is my aunt. I have been standing at the window for a quarter of an hour trying to work out why you looked familiar, and I have just remembered. Your father, forgive me. Was it your father? Wrote a paper on the drainage of the Fenmore level some 15 years ago. I read it as a boy. It was very fine." She stared at him. "He did," she said after a moment. "Yes, he did write that. I thought so. There is a turn of phrase in it about water finding its way home even through stone that I have never forgotten. I am afraid I was 7, and I asked my tutor whether that was true, of everything, and he was cross with me for a week." He smiled. Then it was not a courting smile. It was a small, private, self-amused smile. The smile of a man who was telling a small joke against himself because he had no other way of apologizing for having crossed a room to speak to a stranger. Prudence, who had trained herself against many things, had not trained herself against this. She felt quite distinctly the small, warm, treacherous thing behind her ribs again, and she was so angry with herself for feeling it that she said, more sharply than she meant, "You do not need to be kind to me, sir. I have been talked to a great deal these last 6 weeks. I do not require another well-wisher." He did not flinch. He looked at her steadily and said, "I am not being kind. I am telling you that your father wrote a paper that changed how I have thought about water for 20 years. If you take that as kindness, Miss Marchcombe, it is because you are unused to being told the truth, which is not, I think, your fault." There was a silence. In the silence from across the room, the Dowager Countess of Ellsworth, who had been watching them without appearing to, took a long, slow sip of her tea, and permitted herself the very faint smile of a woman who has laid a trap and heard it close. He did not stay long, that first afternoon. He spoke to her for perhaps a quarter of an hour, on subjects that were not her ruin, on the drainage of the Fenmore levels, on a book he had been reading about the Roman aqueducts, on a small argument he had had with his steward about a bridge. He noticed, once, that she was cold. and moved a screen so the draft from the window did not reach her. He did not, she was almost certain, do it as a gallantry. He did it because he had noticed. When he took his leave, he bowed to Mistress Vale first, and to Prudence second, and said, only, I hope you will be here next Thursday, Miss Marchcombe. I have not finished being wrong about aqueducts. When he had gone, Mistress Vale looked at Prudence sidelong over the rim of her cup and said, Prudence, my dear. What? Said Prudence. Do you know who that was? He said his name was Wycliffe. His name is Wycliffe, said Mistress Vale. And he is the Prince Alistair of Fenmore, and he is the second son of the king, and since his elder brother's death at Talavera, he has been the heir presumptive to the throne of this kingdom. And I have known him since he was a boy in short coats, and I have never in my life seen him cross a room to speak to a stranger. Prudence set down her cup very carefully, so that it did not chip against the saucer. I see, she said. She did not go. The next Thursday, she sat instead in Mistress Vale's back parlor, and wrote a long letter to her father's old solicitor about the disposition of the Marchcombe portion, and she did not go the Thursday after that, either. On the third Thursday, when Mistress Vale said mildly at breakfast, You know, my dear, the Countess did particularly ask after you. Prudence set down her toast and said, Cousin, I am not going to be a story. I have been a story once already, and it was not agreeable. If His Highness wishes to speak to me, he may write. He wrote that afternoon. The note was brief. He was, he said, sorry to have missed her twice. He had been thinking about her father's paper, and had a question he could not settle from the text alone. If she would be so good as to receive him in Mistress Vale's parlor on Friday, he would be very grateful. He signed the note, quite simply, Alistair Wycliffe. There was no crest, there was no seal. She showed it to Mistress Vale. Mistress Vale read it and said only, Well, that is a man who has thought about it. He came on the Friday. He was shown into the small parlor where Prudence had been standing on the night of the Duke of Ravenshaw's visit 6 weeks before, and he was in that room unmistakably too large for it, not in body, but in what he brought with him. And yet he sat down in Mistress Vale's second-best chair as though he had been sitting in it all his life, and asked, without preamble, his question about the paper. It was a real question. She answered it. He asked another. She answered that too. They spoke for 2 hours. Mistress Vale, who had come in with the tea, went out again, and came back with fresh tea, and went out again, and finally settled in the corner with her needlework, and did not pretend to be doing anything but listen. At the end of the 2 hours he stood up and said, Miss Marchcombe, I am going to be honest with you, because I do not think you have very much patience left for anything else. And I do not blame you. Prudence, who was seated, folded her hands in her lap and said, Please, I heard about what was done to you at St. Anselm's, he said. I heard it from 3 separate people within a week. I heard it in the way people tell such stories, which is to say with a great deal of relish and a small addition each time to make themselves interesting. And the third time I heard it, I was standing in a room full of people who were laughing. And I found I could not laugh, and I walked out, and I asked my aunt to arrange that I meet you. She looked at him. So it was arranged, she said quietly. The meeting was arranged. The rest was not. I did not know, when I crossed the room to you, that I would want to come back. I have come back because I want to, Miss Marchcombe. I am telling you this because you have been lied to enough for one lifetime, and I do not propose to add to it. May I call again? She was silent a long moment. She could feel Mistress Vale's needle in the corner, quite still. You may call again, Your Highness, she said. On one condition. Name it. Before you call again, you will tell me the truth, all of it, whatever it is you are not saying. I do not bargain with half a story. I have done that already. And it cost me my morning. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "That is fair. And I will." He came back 3 days later. He told her, sitting in the same chair, in a plain, low voice, several things. He told her that his elder brother's death had left him heir, and that the king his father was ill, and that within a year, perhaps 2, he would be called to the throne. He told her that he was expected, and had been expected for some time, to marry a princess of one of the northern German houses, and that he had refused 3 such matches quietly, on grounds of health or temperament, but that he could not refuse indefinitely. He told her that he had believed, until the previous month, that he would in the end submit, because he could see no alternative that was not selfish. He told her that on the 3rd telling of her story in the laughing drawing-room, he had understood, with a clarity that had surprised him, that the world had for some time been laying down a great many women who did not deserve to be laid down, and that he had been silent about all of it, and that he did not wish to be silent about her. "That is not a proposal, Miss Marchcombe," he said. "I have no right to make one. My hand is not entirely mine. But I wanted you to know that I have not come to your cousin's parlor to amuse myself. I have come because I am trying to work out whether it is possible to spend the rest of my life doing something more useful than being silent. And I would like to work it out with you, if you will let me." Prudence, who had trained herself against many things, and had, in the last 6 weeks, trained herself against several more, discovered that she had not trained herself against a plain-spoken man saying a plain thing in her cousin's second-best chair. "You may come on Fridays," she said when she could trust her voice, "and on Tuesdays if you are in town. I will not have you every day. I have work of my own to do." "What work?" he said. She hesitated. And then, because he had told her the truth and she had asked for it, she said, "I have been going through my cousin's ledgers." She had been paying 2 of her tenants twice for the same lease for 4 years, because her steward could not add. "I have written to the tenants, and asked whether they might repay the sum in labor on the north wall of the churchyard, which is falling down, and they have agreed. And I am now writing to my father's old solicitor, because I believe the Marchcombe portion has been mismanaged in the same fashion, and I intend to discover by how much." He looked at her. "Miss Marchcombe," he said, "may I ask a question that is not about the paper on the Fenmore levels?" "You may. Would you be willing, some Tuesday, when you are not writing to solicitors, to look at a set of accounts of mine? There is an estate in the north that has been under stewardship since I was a boy, and I have never been satisfied that I understand it." "I would," she said. "Bring them next Tuesday." He brought them next Tuesday. They were, as she had suspected, a mess. She spent 4 hours with them in Mistress Vale's parlor, and at the end of the 4 hours she looked up at him and said, "Your Highness, someone has been stealing from you for 11 years. Not a great deal each year, perhaps £60, but steadily. And they have been clever. They have hidden it in the coal accounts, because no one ever questions coal." He was silent a moment. Then he said, "Who?" "I cannot tell you who, from the ledgers alone. But I can tell you which set of hands has held the pen the coal figures have been written. And I can tell you that those hands have written them differently from the other columns. Your steward, or your steward's clerk. Bring me the household letters they have written you, and I will tell you which." He brought the letters the following Friday. She read them, laid 2 of them side by side against the ledger pages, and pointed. He looked. His face did not change, exactly, but something behind it settled. "That," he said, "is my mother's cousin. He has been my under-steward for 15 years. He held me on his knee when I was 3. I am sorry, Your Highness. You are not to be sorry. You are to be thanked. I have not been robbed by a stranger. I have been robbed by a man who took me on his knee. and I have been letting him do it. Because I could not bear to look. That is my failure, Miss Marchcombe. Not yours." He was quiet a moment. Then he said more quietly still, "You see things, do you not? I have had time to practice." "Yes," he said. "So, I gather." He noticed, over those weeks, a great many things about her. He noticed that she took the chair with its back to the light, always. He noticed that she thanked the maid by name when the tea was brought. He noticed that she never touched the cakes at Mistress Vale's until he had eaten first, and that she then ate one, exactly one, with the composure of a woman who had decided long ago that she would not perform hunger for anyone. He noticed the way she folded her hands when she was about to say a difficult thing. He noticed that she had a small scar at the corner of her mouth, from a childhood fall she had once mentioned once in passing and never mentioned again. He noticed her. She noticed that he was lonely. Not in the way of men who complained of being lonely. In the way of men who had been lonely so long, they had stopped noticing themselves. He came to Mistress Vale's parlor. She came to understand. Because in it he was not being watched by anyone whose living depended on his mood. And because she, Prudence, did not care whether he was pleased. She told him once that a paragraph in a memorandum he had written to the Home Secretary was pompous, and would be better rewritten in plain language, and he had laughed a real surprised laugh, the laugh of a man who had not been contradicted in a decade, and had rewritten it on her cousin's writing desk while she watched. "You are the first person," he said, when he was done, "who has told me a piece of my prose was pompous since I was 14. You should be told more often, Your Highness." "I imagine I should. Will you tell me?" "I will tell you whenever you ask, and sometimes when you do not." He looked at her across Mistress Vale's writing desk. He said quite simply, "Please." Now the world, of course, was talking. It could not do otherwise. Hal, a prince of the blood who had been the despair of every ambassadress in the capital, was calling twice weekly at the parlor of a widow of no consequence, and the woman he was calling on was the same woman who had been abandoned at the altar by the Duke of Ravenshaw not 3 months earlier. The papers took a while to be sure of it, because it seemed absurd, and then they were sure, and then it became the only thing anyone spoke of at dinners in the smart streets. Prudence found that she did not mind. She had been the subject of talk before, and this talk was in her favor, and even if it had not been, she was too busy with the ledgers of 3 estates now to attend to it. Her aunt wrote. Prudence did not answer. Her aunt wrote again. Prudence did not answer. Her aunt came to Mistress Vale's front door in a hired chaise, and asked to be received, and Mistress Vale, without consulting Prudence, told the maid to say that Miss Marchcombe was not at home to callers, who had not made themselves useful and was unlikely to be at home in future. And in the north, in a hunting lodge above a grey lake, the Duke of Ravenshaw read the papers. We shall step for one brief moment into his part of the tale, for it is only fair. He read the papers over his morning coffee, at a table set for 2, opposite Lady Isolde Marchand, who was very beautiful, and who had that morning, as she had every morning, for a fortnight, been faintly out of temper. Wyke. He read the small paragraph in the court news 3 times. He set down the paper. He said without expression, "Isolde, do you recall the woman I was to marry in September?" "The fat one," said Lady Isolde. "Yes, what of her?" "She is engaged, it appears, to Prince Alistair." Lady Isolde laughed. It was a bright, sharp laugh, and it went on a beat longer than it ought to have done. "Oh, Edward, do not be ridiculous. The papers will print anything." "She cannot be." "She is." She waved a small pale hand. "She is," said the Duke of Ravenshaw quietly. "The woman I left at St. Anselm's, and she is now to be the wife of the next king of this country, and I have just understood, Isolde, that I do not know what I have done." Lady Isolde stared at him. "You have done nothing," she said. "You have married. You have not married. You have chosen. That is all." He looked at her across the breakfast table. He looked at her a long time. He noticed for the first time that her laugh had gone on a beat too long. He noticed that she had eaten nothing. He noticed that in the fortnight he had been at the lodge with her, he had not once heard her thank a servant by name. He noticed her at last, and he did not like what he saw. But that is his story, and he will have to work it out on his own. Ours is elsewhere. Prince Alistair asked her, on a Tuesday in December, in Mistress Vale's back parlor, with the snow just beginning at the window, and the fire low. Because Mistress Vale would not spend money on coal, she did not need to spend, if she would consent. He did not go down on one knee. He did not produce a ring. He sat, instead, in his usual chair, and put his hands on his knees, and said, "Prudence, I have spoken to my father. I have told him that I will marry you, or I will marry no one. He has said several things to me, of which the kindest was that I have lost my wits. I have replied that I have found them, in this parlor, over 3 months, and that I am not disposed to lose them again. He will come around. He always does when he is tired enough. But I cannot ask you until you have answered me. Will you marry me, knowing what I am, and knowing what it will cost you to stand next to me, in public rooms full of people who will say cruel things about your figure and my judgment for the rest of our lives?" She looked at him. She let her hands unfold in her lap. "Alistair," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name, "I have been standing in public rooms full of people who say cruel things about my figure since I was 13. I did not need a prince to teach me how. What I did need was a man who did not say them, and who did not let them be said in his hearing, and who could tell me the truth about aqueduct. If you can be that man on the days you are tired, and not only on the days you are rested, then yes, I will marry you." "I can be that man tired," he said. "I have been very tired all my life." "Then yes." "Then, yes," he said, and he took her hand, and he kissed the palm of it, not the back, the palm, where her father's ink had once stained her fingers, and where the ledger of Mistress Vale's tenants had left a callus that had not yet gone, and he said thank you. The wedding was set for the end of February at the Chapel Royal. Now, and here we come to the part of the story that is the reason it will be told by women in kitchens, for a long time after everyone in it is dead. The Duke of Ravenshaw wrote to her. He wrote a fortnight before the wedding. The letter was 6 pages long. He had begun, he said, several drafts, and burned each of them, because none of them had said the thing he had at last understood he needed to say. He had, he wrote, been mistaken. He had been mistaken in September, and in every month since. He had believed that his affections were engaged where they were not, and had mistaken familiarity for feeling. He had since, seeing the announcement of her engagement in the papers, been unable to sleep. He wished her to know that he had ended his connection with Lady Isolde, that he had returned to his northern seat alone, that he was aware that he had no right whatever to write to her, and that he was writing none the less, because he did not wish to be the kind of man who lacked the courage to say what he had understood, however late. He asked, at the end of the 6 pages, whether he might see her, once, before the wedding, in any parlor of her choosing, in the presence of any chaperone she chose, to say to her face what he had put on paper. She read the letter twice. Then she took it into the drawing-room and gave it to Alistair, because they had agreed, in November, that there would be no letters kept from one another. Ever he read it, he handed it back. "What do you wish to do?" he said. "I wish to see him," she said, "once, in this parlor, with you in the room. Not to be cruel, to be finished." "Then, that is what we shall do." The Duke of Ravenshaw came on a grey afternoon. He was shown into Mistress Vale's parlor by the maid, and he had come alone, without gloves, without the tall, hard bearing she remembered from her aunt's drawing room, and when he saw the prince standing at the fire he stopped for 1 full second in the doorway, and then came in and bowed to Alistair first and to Prudence second, exactly as protocol required, and did not raise his eyes from the carpet until he was addressed. "Sit down, your grace," Prudence said, quite gently. He sat. He put his hands on his knees the way she remembered Alistair putting his, and she thought with a strange calm that men were more alike than they knew. "I have not come," said the Duke, "to ask anything of you, Miss Marchcombe. I have come because I owe you a thing I did not have the courage to give you in September, and I would rather give it late than never give it at all. I was wrong. I was cruel. I dressed my cruelty up in a phrase about affections engaged elsewhere, and I sent it to you in a letter I did not even write out fresh because I was a coward, and could not look at you as I did it. There is no reparation for that. But I wanted you to hear me say it, in this room, in the presence of the man who has done what I should have done. I am sorry, Miss Marchcombe. I am very sorry." Prudence was silent a moment. She looked at the Duke of Ravenshaw, who had been the most powerful man in the county, and was now, sitting in her cousin's parlor with his hands on his knees, only a tired man who had made a wrong turn. "Your Grace," she said, "I accept your apology. I do not accept it, because I have forgiven you. I do not know yet whether I have. I accept it because you have troubled to make it, and because a woman who does not accept an apology that has been troubled over teaches men not to trouble. I would not wish to teach any man that. That is more than I deserve," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." Alistair, at the fire, had not spoken. He spoke now. "Ravenshaw," he said quietly, "you will not write to her again. You will not call. You will not seek her out at any gathering. You have said what you came to say, and she has heard it, and that is the end of it. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, your Highness." "Good," said Alistair. "Then, in that case, sit 5 more minutes, and take a cup of tea, and go and let this be the last honest thing between the 3 of us." The Duke of Ravenshaw stayed 5 minutes. He drank his tea. He did not look at Prudence again except once, briefly, as he stood to leave, and in that look she saw, without pity and without triumph, a man understanding, at last, what he had laid down. He bowed. He left. She never saw him again. She was married to Prince Alistair at the Chapel Royal, on the last Saturday of February, in a gown of deep blue velvet, because she had decided at last that she did not need to wear gray any longer. The king, who had come around as his son had predicted, sat in the front pew and wept a little, from tiredness and from a strange late relief, because he had spent 40 years watching his sons marry women. He had chosen for them, and had not until that morning understood how much he had regretted it. The old dowager Countess of Ellsworth sat beside him, and when Prudence walked past her up the aisle, permitted herself the very faint smile of a woman who had laid a trap and heard it close a second time. Mistress Honora Vale, from the second pew, watched Prudence walk to the altar, with her head level and her breath even, and her hands unclasped at her sides, and thought, without saying so, that the girl had been walking like that since she was 13. They lived, thereafter, at the northern estate Alistair had asked her to look at, because Prudence had grown fond of it through its ledgers before she ever saw its rooms, and because Alistair had grown fond of watching her tell him what was wrong with things. When the king his father died 2 years later, they came south for the coronation, and Prudence, in a robe of deep red that had been let out twice for her at her instruction and without embarrassment, was crowned queen consort of the kingdom, in a cathedral full of people who a year before had laughed at her in drawing rooms. She did not look for those faces. She looked instead at her husband, who at the moment the crown touched her head turned his head half an inch, and caught her eye, and did not smile, exactly, because he had never quite learned how to smile in public rooms, but who let her see, in the very corner of his mouth, the small private amused thing he saved only for her. Later that night, in a bedchamber lit by one low fire, because she still would not spend money on coal she did not need to spend, he took her hand and turned it over and kissed the palm of it, as he had kissed it in Mistress Vale's parlor more than a year before, and he said, "Prudence, do you remember the paper on the Fenmore levels?" "I do. Water finding its way home even through stone." "I remember. I have thought all this year," he said, "that it was not water he meant. I think it was you. I think it has been you the whole time, and I have only just been ready to notice." She was quiet a long moment. Then she said, "Alistair, say it plainly. I have spent too long on inference." He looked at her, and he said quite plainly, "I love you. I have loved you since the afternoon you told me. My memorandum was pompous. I love you now. I will love you when we are both old, and no one remembers what any of this looked like. And I think, my darling, I think you are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen. And I am not saying it kindly. I am saying it as a matter of fact because it is a fact, and I have been meaning to say it out loud for months." She let her hands unfold in her lap. "Alistair," she said, "yes, do not say it if it is only gratitude." "It is not gratitude," he said. "Gratitude I owe your cousin, for keeping me in her parlor when I had no business being there. Gratitude I owe your father, for writing the paper. Gratitude I owe the Duke of Ravenshaw, who I will never speak to again as long as I live, for being fool enough to leave you where I could find you. What I owe you, Prudence, is not gratitude. It is my life. I mean to spend it paying." She did not answer him in words. She leaned forward, in the low light of the one fire, and she put her forehead against his, and they stayed that way. A long moment, the two of them, in a room full of small ordinary silence. Now, and this is the ending, child, so, listen. Years later, when Prudence was a woman in her middle age, and her hair had begun to gray at the temples, and she was queen of a country that had to its own quiet astonishment come to be very fond of her, a young woman was presented to her at court who was large and plain and had been laughed at in drawing-rooms since she was 13, and who curtsied to her queen with the trained composure of a woman who had drilled it against a mirror the size of a book. The queen looked at her for a long moment. She saw the folded hands. She saw the level head. She saw the trained eyes. She saw everything. Then she said, quite gently, so that only the girl could hear, "My dear, stand up, and look at me, and know that there is no room you will walk into in the rest of your life that will not, in the end, contain someone who sees you. I promise you, I know." The girl stood up. She looked at the queen. She began, very slowly and with great disbelief, to breathe out. And Prudence, who had once walked out of a cold church in a pearl-gray gown with a 3-sentence letter in her reticule, and had thought in the dark of that carriage that no one would ever again mistake her for a woman who could be chosen, put out her hand and took the girl's hand and did not let it go. She had, in the end, become the woman who stayed, not because she had been kept, because she had chosen in a small back parlor with a low fire to stay standing, and to keep her hands unclenched, and to answer a question about aqueducts as though she had every right to answer it. And a man who noticed things had noticed her, and had gone on noticing her every day thereafter, which is, in the end, what love is, though the poets take longer to say it.